OK, the bill has just been published now for the Assisted Dying Act. It may not become law. Have you changed your mind on it, we're asking? So the proposed bill would allow assisted dying in England and Wales. It's been published. It would make it legal for terminally ill adults to end their own life in certain circumstances. And there's quite a long list, about 10 different things that need to happen. You've got to be over 18 or 18 and over, registered with a GP for at least 12 months, so we won't have essentially tourism of people coming in to do it. You must crucially be expected to die within 6 months. You must have the mental capacity to make the choice. There'll be 2 doctors who will make sure these are your wishes, and that will then go to a high court judge with the power to question the doctors, but also with the power to question the terminally ill person. So it's not your law yet, as I say. It's not the government that's brought it in. It's a backbench Labour MP called Kim Leadbeater. So it's the government has decided that MPs will just be able to vote whichever way they want on this. And you've got MPs going backwards and forwards. The Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, for example, voting in favour of it in 2015, but now 9 years on, he says he's against it. I wonder if you're somebody who's changed your mind. Let's speak to Raymond Tallis, who was Professor of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Manchester, was opposed, now in favour. Paul Carroll worked in public relations, signed up to Dignitas in case he ever needed it. I'll start with you, Paul. You then changed your mind and you wrote a book on the topic called Shaking Hands with Elvis.
I did indeed. A novel which follows the paths of 4 people who've elected for an assisted death in a UK where the legislation has been passed.
So you, just to get this straight, you signed up to Dignitas when you were in perfect health, did you?
Yes, indeed, and touch wood, I'm still in good health. But it was more of, I discussed it with my partner, and it was more of an insurance policy. It was like a precaution. Oh, we'll sign up for that because we may need it in the future. And it seemed, a very liberal, a very easy thing to do. And I can tell you that actually to sign up for Dignitas is very, very easy. It's like one form and one payment, and you're in the system. But then my personal experience with family death started to lead me to change my mind. Then I decided to write Shaking Hands with Elvis, and the more research I did around the world on assisted dying in the countries where it's been legalised led me to change my mind.
OK, what's the headline? What's the key reason you think that it's not a good idea to have this law?
I think, in one word, it desensitizes the idea of death. And as we've seen in the countries that I've been researching, Canada, Belgium, Holland, the Netherlands, the parameters very quickly widen, normally under legal challenge. And then I think as soon as you've made it naturalize this idea that an assisted death is a viable alternative to medical care, palliative care, ongoing care, then it draws more people into the net. And I do know that disabled groups in particular have cited this as a concern, which I hope will get aired in the debate, the parliamentary debate. OK,
the slippery slope argument. Raymond Tallis, Professor of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Manchester. You've gone the other way, I gather, Raymond.
It was a long time ago when I was opposed to assisted dying, way back in 2005, and I feel ashamed for the reasons that I was opposed to it. One is I really didn't look into the facts, and the second, I didn't think about the arguments. And I really did get involved in thinking about the facts and arguments for all sorts of reasons in 2005, and that made me convinced that we needed legislation for assisted dying. And actually, it's interesting, some of the arguments that Paul has put forward are really not relevant to the bill that Kim Leadbeater is putting forward. First of all, the slippery slope argument, which you picked up on, if we look at the at Oregon, whose legislation is closest to the Kim Leadbeater bill, there has been no slippery slope since 1997. We're the beneficiaries of something like 25 or more years of their experience. No slippery slope. 0.5% of deaths by assisted dying. There's no picking out people who are vulnerable, and so on and so forth. All of those worries that people had about when assisted dying was introduced in Oregon have not materialized the examples that Paul gives of Netherlands and Belgium, well, they were starting from a different place. They were at the bottom of the slope, not at the top of the slope. So I think those examples are irrelevant. The only truly relevant one is Oregon, with all that experience and a very similar legislature to ours.
Yeah, because Oregon is very interesting, because you haven't seen evidence, Raymond, in Oregon, for example, of people who are very old being sort of persuaded by family that it would be better for us all if you went now.
It's actually the opposite is the case. If you look at the data from Oregon, the resistance comes from the family, as it were, rather than from the patient. Families are often very resistant to people seeking assisted dying because of their love of the person and so on. But all of the sinister things that have been described may well be the case in Belgium, may well be the case in Netherlands, but they're certainly not the case in the jurisdiction that has a law closest to Kim's law.
Paul, you come back on that. Paul.
So I'm interested in that. Oregon is often cited as the prime example to follow for the UK. But I was more interested in looking at Canada, which introduced assisted dying in 2016. Within 3 years, the parameters were challenged. So that was terminal illness within 6 months, same conditions, doctors, legal sign-off. That was challenged, and the parameters were widened to people with chronic conditions, intolerable suffering, which obviously widens the net, because anybody with an illness, a mental illness, a neurological illness who's facing long-term suffering, then says they qualify. And so the interesting thing, and I'm glad that Parliament is debating this, and I hope they cover all of these areas, is that how can they introduce a law which they say, oh, the conditions are very strict and will never change, when the irony is that the people who are in favour of changing the law are trying to change the existing law. And so the first challenge, if this law went through in its current state, the first challenge would come from the people who have got, for example, neurological or mental disorders.
Well, I do wonder,
we have the same right to die.
Right. I just that makes perfect sense, Raymond Tallis, because looking at this law now as it's proposed, it says the doctor's got to say you'll be dead within 6 months. Now, a lot of doctors will say that is absolutely preposterous because they're not able to put a time scale on it. Someone with motor neurone disease could suffer for 3 years. Why shouldn't they be eligible?
Well, basically, the thing is, you can, as it were, qualify for assisted dying, but for the vast majority of people, and again, I refer you to the Oregon experience, actually it's much closer to the end when they avail themselves of assisted dying. What is, they bank the possibility of having assisted dying, which gives immense reassurance, not only to themselves, but to their family. And as I say, those who do proceed are in a very advanced state. They're far less than 6 months away from dying. And I think it's very, and also it's important to remember that Kim Leadbeater's law, or bill, I should say, includes a review of both palliative care and assisted dying at 5-yearly intervals. And I think that's very important to see whether indeed
all right.
this mythical slippery slope actually materializes.
Before I go back to Paul, I'll just give you one more example, if I may. Forgive me, because I know it's a very sensitive subject, but this is from the Netherlands, and you'll know what I'm about to say. It's a young woman called Zaraya Tipik, and Zaraya was 29, and she was very, very unhappy. She had depression, borderline personality disorder, autism. Major depression was the main thing. She'd had electroconvulsive therapy. Nothing had worked. Medication hadn't worked. And she got permission to have an assisted death, and she died on the 22nd of May this year. And that's the real fear, Raymond, is somebody who is profoundly unhappy may feel this is the choice they want.
Hang on a second. You've got to remember where Netherlands began. They began in the early 80s, as it were, legalizing a situation that was already ongoing. We're starting from a totally different place. And if the Oregon experience is anything to go by, which I trust, essentially we will remain in that place. And actually the other interesting thing about Oregon is that the law was opposed by the palliative care community initially. not long after the law had been up and running, they changed their mind completely and saw that not only was it safe, but also that it did a lot to promote palliative care. And without this law, we're mandating terrible suffering and indeed criminalizing compassionate acts, such as people helping people to go to Dignitas or whatever. That's the awful thing.
Well, that's Paul.
2%, yes.
Yeah, Paul, go on then, yeah.
2% of people who have palliative care suffer for the last 3 months. And that's, a very significant proportion of people suffering uncontrolled symptoms. So this is not a small issue in terms of human suffering.
But Paul, the issue is, you mentioned your partner, and the issue is that person, if they were to help you end your life when you were in so much pain and near the end of it anyway, would be committing a criminal act. And that's what people find. If they do it out of love, it shouldn't be a crime. That's what people find so difficult.
Yeah, I can understand that argument, and I was pro that argument. But if we look at the numbers, I want to know in Parliament, in the debate, how many people do they imagine will avail themselves of an assisted death in this country if that law goes through? In Canada, it's 4% of deaths now are assisted dying, and that's likely to double when they're challenging the conditions again to allow people with mental disorders to apply for assisted dying. So applied to the UK population, are we saying if 50,000 people a year avail themselves of an assisted death by, say, 2035, do we consider that a success? Whereas 50 people go from the UK to Switzerland, all right, most can't afford it, but 50 people a year go to Switzerland to Dignitas to die. If we follow the Canadian model, which there's no reason, nobody can guarantee we won't, are we looking at 50,000 assisted deaths in 10 years' time? Is that a good result? Do the people in favour who are lobbying for it think that's a good outcome or a bad outcome?
OK, thank you very much indeed. Paul Carroll, who worked in public relations, wrote a book called Shaking Hands with Elvis, had signed up to Dignitas, now against assisted dying. Raymond Tallis, Professor of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Manchester. So different views, always with respect, of course, on this important subject. Love your thoughts on whether this bill should go through, whether you want your MP to support it.